In the years after World War II ended, historians kept asking the same question. Why did one of America's most respected commanders remain so quiet about one of the war's most famous generals? The man who stayed silent was Omar Bradley. The man everyone kept asking about was George S. Patton. For decades, Bradley rarely spoke openly about Patton's leadership. When he did, his words were careful, measured, and often incomplete. Yet those who studied the war closely knew that Bradley had seen Patton up close, closer than almost anyone else. He had watched him plan, fight, argue, succeed, and sometimes make dangerous mistakes. Bradley had served beside Patton during some of the most critical campaigns of the Second World War. If anyone truly understood the man behind the legend, it was him. But to understand why Bradley's later reflections mattered so much, we have to go back long before the war made them famous. Long before armored divisions thundered across Europe, both men were young officers trying to find their place in a rapidly changing army. They first met in the early decades of the 20th century, during a time when the United States Army was small, underfunded, and still shaped by the traditions of the 19th century. Both officers had attended the same institution that produced many of America's future military leaders, United States Military Academy. But even then, their personalities could not have been more different. Bradley was quiet and reserved. Fellow officers often described him as calm, thoughtful, and careful with his words. He preferred planning over drama and discipline over showmanship. Soldiers respected him because he seemed steady in moments when others might panic. His style was simple and direct. Bradley believed a commander should listen more than he spoke. Patton was the opposite. From the moment he entered the Army, Patton seemed determined to become a legend. He loved history, especially the great warriors of the past. He studied ancient battles, memorized tactics from famous generals, and believed that boldness on the battlefield could decide the fate of entire wars. Patton was dramatic, outspoken, and absolutely convinced that aggressive action was the key to victory. Even their appearances reflected their personalities. Bradley usually looked like a quiet professor in uniform. Patton looked like a warrior from another age, often wearing polished helmets, ivory-handled pistols, and a fierce expression that made soldiers both admire and fear him. Yet despite these differences, the two men formed a professional respect for each other over time. Both were talented officers, both believed deeply in the importance of leadership, and both were determined to prove that the U.S. Army could become one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. When World War II finally arrived, the careers of Bradley and Patton accelerated rapidly. The United States suddenly needed experienced commanders capable of leading massive armies across multiple continents. Officers who had spent decades preparing suddenly found themselves responsible for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Patton quickly gained a reputation as one of the Army's most aggressive leaders. He believed wars should be fought with speed and relentless pressure. In his view, hesitation allowed the enemy to recover. Patton demanded constant movement from his forces. Tanks should advance. Infantry should push forward. The enemy should never be given time to breathe. Bradley admired some aspects of Patton's boldness, but he also saw the risks. War was not only about speed, it was also about coordination, supply lines, and careful planning. Bradley understood that even the most brilliant attack could fail if logistics collapsed behind it. These different philosophies began to create tension between the two commanders as the war progressed. Patton loved dramatic offensives. Bradley preferred calculated operations that balanced risk and stability. Patton believed momentum could break enemy resistance. Bradley believed discipline and organization ultimately won campaigns. Despite these disagreements, their partnership became one of the most important command relationships in the American war effort. Bradley often served in positions where he had to oversee larger strategic operations, while Patton commanded fast-moving armored forces on the battlefield. This meant Bradley frequently had to evaluate Patton's decisions, sometimes approving them, sometimes restraining them. And that was not always easy. Patton's personality could be explosive. He spoke bluntly, criticized others openly, and sometimes pushed beyond the limits of what his superiors considered acceptable behavior. Several incidents during the war nearly ended his career, yet each time many senior leaders hesitated to remove him from command. Why? Because when Patton fought, he often won. His units moved faster than almost anyone expected. His offensives frequently shattered enemy defenses. Even critics had to admit that his aggressive style could produce astonishing results. Bradley saw all of this from a unique vantage point. He witnessed both the brilliance and the danger of Patton's approach. He watched moments when Patton's instincts proved uncannily correct, and moments when those same instincts nearly created serious problems. For Bradley, evaluating Patton was never simple. He could not ignore the victories, but he could also not ignore the controversies. This complicated reality would follow both men for the rest of their lives. The public often saw Patton as a fearless warrior and Bradley as the calm, steady general. In truth, their relationship was far more complex than that simple image suggested. Behind closed doors, military leaders debated Patton constantly. Was he a reckless commander who took unnecessary risks? Or was he exactly the kind of aggressive leader needed to defeat determined enemies like Nazi Germany? Bradley was one of the few men whose opinion carried enormous weight in that debate. He had worked beside Patton during some of the most critical campaigns of the war. He had watched the general's decisions shape battles and influence entire operations. Few people had a clearer view of both Patton's strengths and his weaknesses. And yet, after the war ended, Bradley did not immediately reveal everything he thought. Part of that silence may have come from respect. Part may have come from caution. The war had ended, but the reputations of its leaders were still being formed in the public imagination. Then, in December 1945, tragedy struck. Only months after the war ended, Patton was severely injured in a car accident near Heidelberg. The legendary general who had commanded vast armies across Europe died shortly afterwards. With Patton gone, the world expected Bradley to speak more openly. After all, he had served beside him during the most dramatic moments of the war. Historians, journalists, and fellow officers all wondered what Bradley truly thought of the man who had become one of the most famous generals in American history. But once again, Bradley remained careful. Years would pass before he offered a more complete picture of Patton. And when he finally did, his reflections revealed something far more interesting than simple praise or criticism. Bradley's final assessment suggested understanding Patton required looking beyond the legend. Behind the dramatic speeches, the polished helmet, and the aggressive battlefield tactics was a commander whose instincts could sometimes change the course of an entire campaign. Patton's boldness carried enormous risks, but in certain moments of the war, those risks produced victories that more cautious commanders might never have attempted. For Bradley, the truth about Patton was not simple, and that truth would only become clearer as the war moved into one of its earliest major tests for both men, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The summer of 1943 would become the first true test of the complicated partnership between Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. Until that point, both men had built reputations inside the U.S. Army, but the coming campaign would place them under the intense pressure of a major Allied invasion. The operation was known as Operation Husky, and it would open a new front in the war against Axis forces in Europe. The island of Sicily sat at the gateway to Italy. Controlling it meant controlling key shipping routes across the Mediterranean. For the Allies, capturing Sicily would weaken Axis power in southern Europe and potentially knock Italy out of the war entirely. For Germany and Italy, losing the island would expose the mainland to invasion. Planning such a massive operation required cooperation between several Allied commanders. Among the most important was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who oversaw the entire campaign. Under Eisenhower, American and British forces prepared. The summer of 1943 would become the first true test of the complicated partnership between Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. Until that point, both men had built reputations inside the U.S. Army, but the coming campaign would place them under the intense pressure of a major Allied invasion. The operation was known as Operation Husky, and it would open a new front in the war against Axis forces in Europe. The island of Sicily sat at the gateway to Italy. Controlling it meant controlling key shipping routes across the Mediterranean. For the Allies, capturing Sicily would weaken Axis power in southern Europe and potentially knock Italy out of the war entirely. For Germany and Italy, losing the island would expose the mainland to invasion. Planning such a massive operation required cooperation between several Allied commanders. Among the most important was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who oversaw the entire campaign. Under Eisenhower, American and British forces prepared to land thousands of troops along the Sicilian coast in July 1943. Within the American command structure, Patton would lead the 7th Army, while Bradley served in a senior command role, working closely with higher headquarters. Although their responsibilities differed, Bradley watched Patton's actions carefully. He understood that the success or failure of Patton's army could influence the entire campaign. When Allied forces landed on July 10, 1943, the situation quickly became chaotic. Strong winds scattered paratroopers across wide areas. Naval forces struggled against rough seas. Units landed in unexpected locations, and communication between commanders was often difficult. But despite the confusion, the Allies managed to secure beachheads along the coast. At first, the mission assigned to Patton's 7th Army was relatively limited. American forces were supposed to protect the left flank of the British 8th Army, which was advancing toward the important port city of Messina. The British commander, Bernard Montgomery, believed his army would carry the main offensive across the island. Patton, however, had other ideas. He believed the American army should not simply guard the flank while British forces received the main credit for victory. Patton saw an opportunity to prove that American troops could fight just as aggressively and effectively as any army in Europe. Very quickly, Patton began pushing his forces forward faster than originally planned. His armored units and infantry columns advanced rapidly across western Sicily. Within days, American troops captured several key towns. Then Patton made a decision that surprised many Allied commanders. Instead of staying focused on defensive support for the British advance, he launched a bold drive toward the city of Palermo on the northwestern coast of the island. For Patton, the logic was clear. Palermo was a major port and transportation center. Capturing it would weaken Axis control of the island and demonstrate the offensive power of the American army. But not everyone agreed with his approach. Some Allied leaders worried that Patton's rapid advance stretched supply lines too far. Others believed he was ignoring the original strategic plan of the campaign. War required coordination, and Patton's aggressive style sometimes made coordination difficult. From Bradley's perspective, the situation revealed both the strength and the danger of Patton's command style. Bradley understood the value of momentum in warfare. When armies moved quickly, enemy defenses often collapsed. Confusion spread through opposing forces, allowing breakthroughs that might otherwise be impossible. Yet Bradley also knew that speed alone could not guarantee victory. An army advancing too quickly could become isolated. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements had to move forward as well. Without those essential supplies, even the most successful attack could suddenly stall. Yet Patton continued pushing forward. American forces reached Palermo by late July. After intense pressure on Italian defenders, the city fell on July 22, 1943. For the United States Army, it was a major symbolic victory. Newspapers celebrated the rapid advance, and Patton's reputation as an aggressive battlefield commander grew dramatically. But the campaign was far from over. The ultimate objective in Sicily was the city of Messina, located on the northeastern tip of the island. Whoever reached Messina first would effectively control the final phase of the campaign. British forces under Montgomery were advancing along the eastern coast, but difficult terrain slowed their progress. Narrow mountain roads and determined Axis defenses made every mile costly. Patton saw another opportunity. Instead of simply holding positions in western Sicily, he ordered his forces to drive across the northern part of the island toward Messina. This move turned the campaign into an unofficial race between the American Army and the British Army. Patton's troops pushed forward through rugged terrain, capturing towns and forcing Axis forces into retreat. The fighting was difficult, but Patton's insistence on speed kept the pressure on enemy defenses. Bradley watched these developments closely. He recognized that Patton's instincts were sometimes remarkably effective. By maintaining constant pressure, American forces prevented enemy units from organizing stronger defensive lines. Axis troops were forced to retreat again and again, often abandoning equipment and positions. At the same time, Bradley remained aware of the risks. Rapid advances could create confusion between units, communication sometimes broke down, and Patton's relentless drive placed enormous strain on soldiers who had already endured weeks of combat. Despite these concerns, Patton's forces continued moving forward. On August 18, 1943, American troops entered Messina. Although many German and Italian soldiers managed to escape across the narrow strait to mainland Italy, the capture of the city marked the effective end of the Sicilian campaign. For Patton, it was a moment of triumph. His army had advanced hundreds of miles across difficult terrain and captured several major cities. American forces had proven they could conduct large-scale offensive operations against experienced Axis defenders. But the campaign also revealed something deeper about Patton's leadership. He thrived in moments of bold decision-making. When an opportunity appeared, he moved quickly, sometimes faster than his fellow commanders expected. For Bradley, observing this style created a lasting impression. He saw firsthand that Patton possessed an instinct for offensive warfare that few commanders could match. Patton understood the psychological power of speed and aggression. When enemy forces began retreating, he pushed them harder, refusing to allow them time to recover. Yet Bradley remained aware of the risks. Rapid advances could create confusion between units, communication sometimes broke down, and Patton's relentless drive placed enormous strain on soldiers who had already endured weeks of combat. Despite these concerns, Patton's forces continued moving forward. On August 18, 1943, American troops entered Messina. Although many German and Italian soldiers managed to escape across the narrow strait to mainland Italy, the capture of the city marked the effective end of the Sicilian campaign. For Patton, it was a moment of triumph. His army had advanced hundreds of miles across difficult terrain and captured several major cities. American forces had proven they could conduct large-scale offensive operations against experienced Axis defenders. But the campaign also revealed something deeper about Patton's leadership. He thrived in moments of bold decision-making. When an opportunity appeared, he moved quickly, sometimes faster than his fellow commanders expected. For Bradley, observing this style created a lasting impression.
He saw firsthand that Patton possessed an instinct for offensive warfare that few commanders could match. Patton understood the psychological power of speed and aggression. When enemy forces began retreating, he pushed them harder, refusing to allow them time to recover. Yet Bradley remained aware of the risks. Rapid advances could create confusion between units, communication sometimes broke down, and Patton's relentless drive placed enormous strain on soldiers who had already endured weeks of combat. Despite these concerns,
By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a decisive turning point. The Allies had finally returned to the continent, landing thousands of soldiers on the beaches of northern France during the massive invasion known as Normandy landings. The operation was one of the most complex military undertakings in history, led by the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. But landing on the beaches was only the beginning. The real challenge was breaking through German defenses and pushing deep into France. In the weeks after the landings, Allied forces faced a frustrating reality. Progress inland was painfully slow. The countryside of Normandy was covered with thick hedgerows, narrow roads, and small villages that gave defending German troops excellent positions. Every field could become a battlefield. Tanks struggled to move through the dense terrain, and infantry units often had to fight for every 100 meters. At the center of these difficult operations was Omar Bradley, who commanded the American First Army during the early stages of the campaign. Bradley was responsible for coordinating large numbers of troops along the western part of the Allied front. His job required patience and careful planning. Breaking through the German defenses would take time. But one commander was waiting impatiently behind the lines. That commander was George S. Patton. For months before the invasion, Patton had been kept out of the main assault. Part of this was due to political controversy surrounding him earlier in the war, but another reason involved deception. Allied planners had used Patton as the centerpiece of a major misinformation campaign designed to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would occur somewhere else. As a result, German commanders believed Patton was preparing a large army for a different landing site. This deception operation, known as Operation Fortitude, successfully misled German forces and kept many enemy divisions away from Normandy. But once the invasion was underway, Patton was eager to return to active command. By late July 1944, Bradley and other Allied leaders believed the time had come for a major breakthrough. After weeks of slow fighting, they launched a powerful offensive called Operation Cobra. Massive aerial bombardments struck German defensive lines near the town of St. Lo, creating an opening in the front. This was the moment Patton had been waiting for. As soon as the breakthrough began, Patton's newly activated Third Army surged into the gap. Unlike the slow, grinding battles of the hedgerows, Patton now had open terrain in front of him. For a commander who believed in speed and aggressive maneuver, it was the perfect battlefield. Within days, his armored divisions began racing across the French countryside. German forces, already weakened by the bombardment and weeks of fighting, struggled to react. Patton's units moved so quickly that many German commanders could not reorganize their defenses in time. Roads filled with retreating enemy vehicles, supply depots were captured before they could be destroyed. For Bradley, watching this rapid advance was both impressive and challenging. As Patton's superior in the American command structure, Bradley had to coordinate the movements of multiple armies across a rapidly changing front line. The faster Patton moved, the more complex that coordination became. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Fuel trucks had to follow the advancing tanks. Communication between units had to be maintained despite constant movement. Yet despite these logistical difficulties, Patton kept pushing forward.
His forces liberated town after town across France. In some areas, American armored columns advanced dozens of miles in a single day. Civilians greeted the soldiers as liberators, cheering as tanks rolled through streets that had been under German control for 4 years. The speed of the advance stunned both Allied and German observers. German commanders had expected a slow Allied push after the Normandy invasion. Instead, they suddenly faced a rapidly expanding front where American forces appeared in places they had not anticipated. Entire German formations were forced into retreat, abandoning equipment and defensive positions. At the center of this dramatic shift in momentum was Patton's relentless leadership style. He believed that hesitation could destroy an opportunity. If an enemy line broke, the attacking army had to move immediately before the defenders could regroup. Patton constantly pressured his commanders to maintain speed, sometimes sending blunt messages demanding faster movement. Bradley understood exactly what was happening. He saw that Patton's instincts for offensive warfare were producing results that few commanders could match. The German army in France was being pushed back faster than many Allied planners had predicted. But Bradley also knew that such rapid advances came with serious risks. Fuel shortages began to appear as supply lines struggled to keep up with the advancing forces. Patton's tanks and trucks consumed enormous amounts of gasoline, and every mile forward required more supplies to follow behind. In several cases, Patton's units were forced to slow down simply because fuel had not yet arrived. These logistical limits created tension among Allied leaders. Some commanders believed Patton should pause and consolidate his gains. Others argued that slowing down might allow German forces to rebuild their defenses. Bradley found himself in the middle of this difficult decision. On one hand, he admired the results Patton was achieving. The rapid advance across France had shattered German plans and brought Allied forces closer to Germany's borders far sooner than expected. On the other hand, Bradley understood that the war was not yet won. A reckless push without proper supply support could expose Allied armies to dangerous counterattacks. Despite these concerns, the overall impact of Patton's offensive was undeniable. By late summer 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had transformed the entire war in Western Europe. German forces that once defended strong positions along the French coast were now retreating across large areas of the country. For Bradley, this period revealed something important about Patton. He realized that Patton's greatest strength was not simply his aggressiveness, it was his ability to recognize moments when the enemy was vulnerable and then exploit those moments with overwhelming speed. Many commanders could plan careful operations, but very few could move entire armies with the kind of relentless momentum that Patton demanded. Bradley would later reflect on these campaigns with a deeper understanding of what he had witnessed. Patton's style was dangerous at times, but it could also produce dramatic breakthroughs when the battlefield conditions were right. In Normandy and across France, that aggressive instinct helped turn a difficult invasion into a rapidly expanding Allied offensive. Yet greater tests were still ahead. By the winter of 1944, the Allies believed Germany was close to defeat. Many soldiers expected the war to end within months. But deep inside the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, German commanders were preparing a massive surprise attack that would challenge everything the Allies thought they knew about the war. And when that attack came, Patton would once again make one of the most remarkable moves of his entire career.
By the winter of 1944, many Allied soldiers believed the war in Europe was entering its final phase. German forces had been pushed out of France, Allied armies were approaching Germany's borders, and there was a growing sense that the collapse of Nazi Germany might come sooner than expected. But deep within the German high command, one last massive offensive was being planned. In December 1944, German forces launched a surprise attack through the dense forests of the Ardennes region. The operation would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's attempt to split Allied armies, capture the important port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. The attack caught many Allied units completely off guard. Snow covered the forests and hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, limiting air support and making movement difficult. German armored divisions pushed forward through weakly defended sectors of the Allied line. Within days, they created a large bulge in the front lines, giving the battle its famous name. Entire American units were forced to retreat as German forces advanced rapidly. At the center of the German offensive was a small but strategically critical town, Bastogne. Several major roads passed through Bastogne, making it a key transportation hub. Whoever controlled the town could move troops and supplies in multiple directions across the region. Recognizing its importance, American commanders rushed to reinforce the town. One of the units sent to defend Bastogne was the famous 101st Airborne Division. These paratroopers quickly dug in around the town, preparing defensive positions while German forces continued to close in from multiple directions. Within days, Bastogne was surrounded. German units cut off supply routes and launched repeated attacks against the defenders. Winter conditions made the situation even worse. Snow covered the ground, temperatures dropped below freezing, and many soldiers lacked proper winter equipment. Inside Bastogne, the American defenders faced a difficult reality. They were isolated, low on ammunition, and under constant pressure from enemy forces. While these events unfolded in the Ardennes, several hundred miles away, another army was preparing for action. That army belonged to George S. Patton. At the time of the German offensive, Patton's Third Army was positioned farther south, engaged in operations along a different section of the front. When reports of the surprise attack reached Allied headquarters, commanders quickly realized the scale of the crisis. Among those analyzing the situation was Omar Bradley. Bradley understood that the German offensive threatened to disrupt the entire Allied strategy in Western Europe. If German forces captured Bastogne and continued advancing, they could divide Allied armies and create a serious strategic setback. The question facing Allied commanders was simple but incredibly difficult to answer. How could they respond quickly enough to stop the German advance? During a critical meeting of Allied leaders, Patton made a bold statement. While other commanders discussed possible responses that might take weeks to organize, Patton claimed he could move his entire army north to relieve Bastogne in just a matter of days. Many officers in the room were skeptical. Moving a large army during winter conditions was already complicated. Redirecting an entire offensive force across frozen roads and crowded supply lines seemed almost impossible, yet Patton insisted it could be done. In fact, he had already begun preparing for the possibility. Patton believed that good commanders must anticipate unexpected developments. When early reports suggested German forces might launch a winter offensive, he quietly instructed his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid change in direction. As a result, when the crisis erupted, Patton's headquarters already had several operational plans ready. Within hours of receiving the order, the Third Army began one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. Instead of continuing its previous advance, Patton ordered his entire force to pivot north, almost like a door swinging on its hinge. This massive movement required extraordinary coordination. Tanks, artillery units, supply trucks, and thousands of soldiers had to change directions simultaneously. Roads were crowded with military vehicles. Snow and ice made driving extremely dangerous. Communication lines had to remain open while units moved across unfamiliar terrain. Yet despite these challenges, Patton pushed his army forward with relentless urgency. His goal was clear: reach Bastogne before the surrounded defenders were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, inside the town, American soldiers continued holding their positions under constant attack.
German commanders demanded the surrender of the garrison, believing the situation was hopeless. The American response became legendary. When German officers delivered a message demanding surrender, the acting American commander famously replied with a single word: nuts. The defenders of Bastogne refused to give up. As the days passed, the pressure on the surrounded troops grew more intense. Ammunition supplies were dangerously low, medical resources were limited. Every new German assault threatened to break through the defensive perimeter. But help was coming. Patton's armored columns pushed through difficult terrain, fighting through German resistance as they moved closer to the town. Every mile gained brought them closer to the exhausted defenders. Finally, on December 26, 1944, elements of Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne and broke through the German encirclement. The arrival of American tanks ended the isolation of the town and allowed supplies and reinforcements to reach the defenders. Although heavy fighting continued in the surrounding region, the successful relief of Bastogne marked a major turning point in the battle. For many historians, this maneuver remains one of Patton's most remarkable achievements. Redirecting an entire army during a winter offensive and doing it fast enough to save a surrounded garrison required extraordinary confidence and planning. From Bradley's perspective, the operation revealed something critical about Patton's leadership. Patton possessed an unusual ability to make rapid decisions during moments of crisis. Where other commanders saw logistical obstacles and operational delays, Patton saw opportunity. He believed speed could solve problems that careful planning alone could not. Bradley understood that such boldness carried risks. A maneuver of that scale could easily have failed if coordination broke down or if German resistance proved stronger than expected. But in this case, the gamble worked. The successful relief of Bastogne not only stabilized the Allied front, but also demonstrated that German forces could no longer achieve decisive victories on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, but the momentum had begun shifting back toward the Allies. For Bradley, watching these events unfold reinforced a complicated truth he had been observing throughout the war. Patton's aggressive instincts could be dangerous, but at critical moments, they could also change the course of an entire campaign. And after the war ended, this realization would become an important part of how Bradley eventually described the legacy of the man who had led that daring march to Bastogne.
When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, millions of soldiers returned home, and the world began trying to understand the enormous conflict that had reshaped the 20th century. Among the many figures who captured the public imagination, few were more famous than George S. Patton. His dramatic speeches, aggressive tactics, and lightning-fast armored advances had turned him into one of the most recognizable Allied commanders of the war. But behind the legend stood another general who had observed Patton closer than almost anyone else, Omar Bradley. Bradley had worked beside Patton during some of the most important campaigns in Western Europe. He had watched the general command armies across Sicily, France, and Germany. He had seen Patton's remarkable battlefield instincts, but he had also witnessed the controversies that followed him throughout the war. After Germany surrendered, the United States Army began shifting from wartime operations to occupation duties. Commanders who had spent years directing massive battles suddenly faced the challenge of maintaining order in defeated territories while preparing for a very uncertain future. Then, only months after the war ended, something unexpected happened. In December 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident near the city of Heidelberg. The collision itself was not dramatic by wartime standards, but the consequences were devastating. Patton suffered severe spinal injuries that left him paralyzed. For days, doctors tried to stabilize his condition. The general, who had survived countless battlefield dangers, now faced a completely different struggle. 12 days later, Patton died from complications related to his injuries. The news shocked both the military and the public. Only weeks earlier, Patton had been commanding one of the most powerful armies in Europe. Now, the man whose name had become synonymous with aggressive warfare was suddenly gone. For many Americans, Patton immediately became a legendary figure. Stories about his daring offensives spread through newspapers and books. Soldiers who had served under him described his ability to inspire troops and push armies forward when victory seemed uncertain. Yet within military circles, discussions about Patton were often more complicated. Some officers admired his aggressive leadership and believed his speed on the battlefield had shortened the war. Others criticized his impulsive behavior and believed his boldness sometimes created unnecessary risks. Few people understood this balance better than Bradley. Throughout the war, Bradley had often found himself evaluating Patton's decisions. As a senior commander responsible for coordinating multiple armies, he sometimes had to approve, modify, or restrain Patton's operations. This gave Bradley a unique perspective. He saw the moments when Patton's instincts proved astonishingly accurate. He also saw situations where Patton's relentless push forward created serious logistical challenges or political problems. After Patton's death, many historians and journalists expected Bradley to become one of the most important voices explaining Patton's legacy. But Bradley did not rush to offer dramatic statements. For years, he spoke cautiously about Patton. His public comments were respectful, but often restrained. Instead of repeating the dramatic stories that made headlines, Bradley tended to focus on broader lessons about leadership and warfare. Some historians wondered why he remained so careful. Part of the reason may have been Bradley's personality. Unlike Patton, Bradley rarely enjoyed public attention. He believed military leadership should be judged by results rather than dramatic speeches or personal reputation. But over time, Bradley began sharing more detailed reflections about the war. In interviews, speeches, and later writings, he gradually revealed a more complete view of the man he had served beside. One of the most important sources of these reflections appeared in his well-known memoir, A Soldier's Story. In that book and in later discussions, Bradley made an observation that surprised many readers. He explained that understanding Patton required separating personality from battlefield performance. Patton's personality was often controversial. He could be outspoken, impatient, and sometimes reckless with his words. These qualities created tensions with both political leaders and fellow officers. But when Bradley examined Patton purely as a battlefield commander, his assessment was more nuanced. He acknowledged that Patton possessed an extraordinary instinct for offensive warfare. Few generals understood the psychological impact of speed and momentum the way Patton did. When enemy defenses began to weaken, Patton pushed forward with relentless pressure. According to Bradley, this instinct sometimes allowed Patton to achieve breakthroughs that more cautious commanders might have missed. Bradley also emphasized something that many casual observers overlooked. Patton's success was not only about aggression, it was also about preparation. Despite his dramatic public image, Patton spent enormous amounts of time studying military history, planning operations, and training his troops. The speed of his armies often came from careful organization behind the scenes. Bradley understood that this combination, bold instinct supported by intense preparation, was one of Patton's greatest strengths. At the same time, Bradley did not ignore the risks. He acknowledged that Patton's style required strong coordination with other commanders. Aggressive offensives could disrupt broader strategies if they were not properly integrated into the overall plan of the campaign. In other words, Patton worked best within a command structure that balanced his aggressiveness with strategic oversight. Bradley's reflections revealed something important about wartime leadership.
Victory rarely depends on a single personality type. Successful armies often rely on different kinds of commanders working together. Some leaders specialize in bold attacks. Others excel at planning and coordination. During World War II, the partnership between Bradley and Patton represented exactly that kind of balance. Patton drove armies forward with relentless energy. Bradley ensured that those advances remained connected to the larger strategic objectives of the Allied war effort. Looking back on the war years later, Bradley offered a conclusion that many historians found striking. He suggested that Patton was not simply a reckless gambler or a flawless battlefield genius. Instead, he was a commander whose aggressive instincts could produce extraordinary results under the right conditions. Patton's brilliance, Bradley implied, lay in his ability to sense moments when speed and boldness could break an enemy's will. Those moments appeared during campaigns in Sicily, during the rapid advance across France, and during the dramatic relief of Bastogne in the winter of 1944. Bradley had watched each of those moments unfold in real time. And by the time he finally shared his reflections more openly, he seemed to recognize something that had not always been obvious during the chaos of war. Patton's greatest strength and his greatest risk were exactly the same thing. His relentless drive to attack, move, and pursue the enemy could create dangerous situations. But that same drive could also transform difficult battles into decisive victories. In the end, Bradley's words helped reshape how many historians understand Patton's legacy. Rather than viewing him only as a dramatic figure from wartime stories, Bradley encouraged people to see him as a complex commander whose instincts sometimes changed the course of entire campaigns. And coming from the man who had stood beside him through some of the most critical moments of the war, that judgment carried a weight that few others could match.